Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. Today we will talk about Antonin Artaud's Theater of Cruelty and Postdramatic Theater. The theater, as most people know it, is a pleasant place, predominantly. Theatergoers dress up for an evening of enjoyment. Even boundary-pushing shows only excite us for the time being, with only some leaving a lasting impact on our cognition. The theater is rarely uncomfortable. It doesn't harm or assault us, and we don't expect to feel fear or uneasiness. However, Antonin Artaud's Theater of Cruelty is meant to challenge the notion of theater as an escape to realistic fantasy and to convince us of theater's role as a crude attacker of the human subconscious. What does that mean? And where did this idea come from? And first of all, who was Artaud? Antonin Artaud was born in Marseille, France in 1896. He contracted spinal meningitis as a young child and spent long stretches in sanatoriums during his youth. While he read widely during this time, he also developed a lifelong dependence on opiates. After World War I, he moved to Paris intending to pursue a career as a writer, but he became interested in surrealism and the avant-garde theater scene, and he began training and performing with directors. Artaud also had a great interest in cinema and appeared in over 20 films. Artaud struggled to start theaters and wrote manifestos for most of the 1930s. After a strange and disastrous episode in which he traveled to Ireland and was deported in a straitjacket, The Theater and Its Double was published in 1938. Already behaving erratically and increasingly fascinated with magic and astrology, Artaud spent much of World War II in asylums and psychiatric hospitals. He received electroshock treatments, and during this period, he continued writing and drawing. In 1948, he was diagnosed with cancer and died shortly afterwards. To talk about Artaud's work, we have to go back to Surrealism. Evolving from Dadaism, Surrealism was a movement in art and literature that represented a reaction against the destruction brought by the rationalism that had guided European cultures and politics and turning nations into war machines. The horrors of World War I shook people into despair and suspicion of what reality is. Reason and order, the things realism depended so much on, were seen as obstruction to truth-seeking. After World War I, French writer and poet André Breton and others began experimenting with automatic writing. Automatic writing is the process of writing without using the conscious mind. The method is often practiced while the person writing is in a trance state. Others are fully awake, alert, and aware of their surroundings, but not of the actions of their writing hand. Writers would use mechanical techniques or subconscious associations. The latter apparently draws heavily on theories adapted from Freud. Breton believed that chance, spontaneity, and the unconscious might lead a writer into a dreamlike state in which they could discover the source of aesthetic truth. The world of dream and fantasy, joined with the everyday rational world, would thus expose an absolute reality, a surreality. In a sense, surreal is not unreal, but super real, more than real. And for surrealists, the observed material reality simply isn't real enough. In The Surrealist Mind, written by John Herbert Matthews, he says, among those who do not comprehend surrealism are people who look upon the real as verifiable, as something to be checked against past experience or observation. These individuals fail to see that for the surrealist, the dimensions of the real cannot be gauged by reference to the familiar. So far as the real appears to have limits, they are foisted upon it by the mental, emotional, and imaginative limitations of spectators accustomed to measure the possible by the already known. For this reason, surrealism and many of its contemporary opponents remained inevitably at loggerheads. The one group insisted on estimating the scope of reality by its possibilities. The other condemned the real to be repetitive of what the past had shown them. In 1924, Breton appointed Artaud as his first director of research for surrealism, but then Breton kicked Artaud out of his circle 2 years later in an effort to separate Dadaist anarchists from the psychoanalytic aims of his followers. In response, Artaud and his playwright friends, Roger Vitrac and Robert Aron, co-founded the theater Alfred Jarry. On the current slide are photo montages from a Theater Alfred Jarry pamphlet, superimposing multiple post images of the actress Josette Lusson, Roger Vitrac, and Antonin Artaud. These are not scenes from a particular play, but they're images directed by Artaud from his imagination. Technically, the surrealist movement in France, from its inception in 1924 until the World War II, presented only 17 theatrical productions. Since most of these ran a single evening and none more than 3, surrealism produced no more than 30 evenings of theater in the course of a decade and a half. Even though Artaud and Roger Vitrac were rejected by the surrealist movement at the time, Theater Alfred Jarry's statement of intention come very close to being manifestos for a surrealist theater. It says, their efforts are directed toward creating a theater which will develop in the direction of complete liberty and which will have no other aim than satisfying the most extreme demands of the imagination and of the spirit. For them, the theatrical event can no longer rest upon an illusion, but corresponds to a reality of the same order as the other tangible realities. However, Artaud's major contribution to world theater was not the few productions at Theater Alfred Jarry or later his Theater of Cruelty. His manifestos, which were published in 1938 under the title The Theater and Its Double, were extremely influential. Writing in the tradition of Rousseau, who believed that civilization had corrupted mankind, Artaud argued for a theater that would return modern humans to primitive mysteries through their bodies. Artaud urged theater artists to reject the dramatic masterpieces of the Western tradition. In fact, to throw out all text-based theater and its hypocrisy, and embrace instead performance involving music, dance, and spectacle. Artaud wanted to abolish the stage and auditorium and have spectators sit in the middle of a large room, watching the action around them. In other words, Artaud promoted total immersion in the theater as a ritual. If you remember from 40A, ritual is one of the 2 potential origins of theater. Artaud's inspiration came from a Balinese ritual dance he witnessed at the Paris Colonial Exposition in 1931. Artaud believed that the Balinese dancers' primitive rhythms and chants held the key to transformative theater. In The Theater and Its Double, Artaud proposed what he called a theater of cruelty. The cruelty in Artaud's idea was sensory. It exists in the work's capacity to shock and confront the audience, to go beyond words and connect with the emotions, to wake up the nerves and the heart. He believed gesture and movement to be more powerful than text. Sound and lighting could also be used as tools of sensory disruption. Theater should thus be an act of organized anarchy. Despite the disruptive, chaotic appearance of theater of cruelty, Artaud believed that his ideas of actor-spectator communion could provide the basis for a truly utopian society, free from violence, conformity, and anxiety. We can look at Artaud's theater as an extension and radicalization of Aristotelian catharsis, which demands, if you remember, full involvement of audience and spectator. And in Artaud's case, submission to the unconscious mind. At the same time, theater of cruelty is far from a follower of Aristotelian drama. Quite the opposite. It vehemently challenges Aristotle's placement of priority on plot, character, and most importantly, mimesis, or representation. Jacques Derrida, who's the most prominent philosopher of the 20th century, commented on Artaud, saying, "The theater of cruelty is not a representation. It is life itself, in the extent to which life is unrepresentable." Indeed, while it can be argued that Artaud's ideas are not always coherent or consistent, Artaud gave a dramatic, even prophetic voice to what may be described as the crisis of representation, perceived by many 20th century philosophers and language theorists. It's fair to say that Artaud's theories have changed the course of contemporary theater. His work had a profound impact on a generation of European playwrights, including Jean Genet and Samuel Beckett. We will talk about Beckett next week with Theater of the Absurd. The director, Peter Brook, was a major advocate for Artaud's ideas. His productions of King Lear and the Marat Sade were most explicitly influenced by Artaud's thinking. Artaud's ideas spread beyond the world of theater. Jim Morrison, lead singer of the 1960s American band The Doors, was inspired by Artaud's writings on ritual and spectacle in performance. John Cage, Merce Cunningham, and the Living Theater have all acknowledged a debt to Artaud. The famous cultural critic Susan Sontag wrote that Artaud's impact was so great that the course of all recent theater in Western Europe and the Americas can be said to divide into two periods, before Artaud and after Artaud. A later term, postdramatic theater, developed by the German theater researcher Hans Thies Lehmann, echoes Artaud's work in an attempt to summarize some tendencies to separate theater and drama in Western avant-garde theater since the end of the 1960s. Here, the word dramatic is not interchangeable with theatrical, but rather it emphasizes at the same time the dominance of text or speech and the intactness of a story arc. The prefix post does not mean text is abandoned. Like theater of cruelty, post-dramatic theater uses text as one of the theatrical elements, which means the literal or figurative meaning of the text is no more important than the rhythm, pitch, length, sonority, and texture of its utterance. Post-dramatic theater is less concerned with ritual, as a theater of cruelty is, but when it comes to storytelling, the narrative is usually porous and open for interpretation. It's often hard to extract an Aristotelian plotline or a psychologically realistic character from a post-dramatic theater work. There is so much more to be said about theater of cruelty and post-dramatic theater, but at the same time, nothing we say can do justice to either of them, precisely because of their rejection of the convenient monopoly by language. Postdramatic theater describes a kind of theater that cannot be taken in at once, not easily surveyable, and a theater that does not make the world manageable to us. Fundamentally, because postdramatic theater practitioners believe that the world we live in now, globalized and mediatized as it is less surveyable and manageable than ever. Here is an example of a post-dramatic theater work before we end this lecture. This is a trailer of Wut, or Rage, by Alfreda Jelinek. There's a content warning. There's gunshots, nudity, and blasphemy. Let's take a look.
Kilometerweit.
Es tut mir so leid.
Eine Saat! Eine Saat sollen wir sein! Oder anders gefragt, ist das unser Prophet oder treibt jemand Scherz mit uns? Man muss töten, solange man noch eine Wut hat. Die vergeht nämlich relativ schnell.
Okay. So here's a review of this production by theater critic Thomas Schmidt. Wood reflects the rage of young people organizing in anti-neoliberal circles and submitting their rage on the world, on commerce, on the media, on the image ban. It is a large tabloid of nearly non-structured material where the various voices are grouped into figures. The language is sharp and hard and spoken in soliloquies and as polyphonies.